Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. As always, thank you so much for your questions. If your question doesn't get answered in this video, then just go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this post. And as always, don't forget to like all the questions which you want to be answered because I answer them in order of how many likes they have. So let's get started. Joseph Ode asks, simple question, why don't you move to Japan now? Of course, if you have any current life goals that are America-based, like going to an American university, you should finish those first, but why don't you move to Japan afterwards? I feel as though you would grow and succeed a lot more in all your MIA and language endeavors. For example, you could become much more motivated to reach a native sounding level in your Japanese accent. So my first impression when I read this question was that whoever asked this is kind of projecting onto me or has a certain vision of my life and me that isn't really accurate, because the way the question is posed is that going to Japan would somehow be the norm or, the standard. And by not going to Japan, I'm somehow going against that norm and kind of going against the grain. But in reality, from my point of view, that's not the case at all. In fact, the opposite is true. I'm an American person. I live in the United States. I like living in the United States. I speak English. All my friends and family live in the United States. And so, really, the norm or standard would be for me to continue living in the United States, and it would actually be me kind of making a radical out of the norm decision if I decided to immigrate to Japan, this foreign country where I don't have any relatives or anything, and I would be considered an outsider or a foreigner. Now, of course, I can understand why people would be interested in this question, right? Because it's like, oh, you've studied Japanese so long, you're so fluent in Japanese, don't you want to use your Japanese? But really the answer to that is not really. I mean, to be honest, I dedicated 6 years of my life to studying Japan, studying Japanese, studying their culture, interacting with Japanese people. And even though I wasn't inside of the country for most of that, I still feel like I was able to become very intimate with Japan and Japanese culture through the internet and through media and through it. Japanese people, meeting Japanese people through the internet, meeting Japanese people who were either immigrated here or spending, over here temporarily. And so really that, big hunger that was inside of me to become intimate with Japanese culture has kind of already been filled. And I'm kind of ready to move on to the next thing in my life. I still think Japan is cool. There's lots of aspects of the culture and the language that I like. And I still enjoy doing things in Japanese when I have time. But really, I'm not that interested in continuing to pursue the path of reaching the highest possible level in Japanese. Now, of course, I haven't completed this path. If I still thought the way I thought a few years ago, I'd probably be thinking, oh, I still want to perfect my pitch accent. I want to get better at speaking. I want to learn how to do kansai ben. I want to study Japanese comedy, maybe try to be able to make Japanese people laugh, maybe practice actually doing the type of comedy that Japanese people do, maybe one day trying to go to Japan and be on Japanese TV, either as an intellectual that can offer other points of view, or as a comedian, or as maybe an author, do something that would, in Japan somehow, represent the pinnacle of mastery of Japanese and the understanding of Japanese culture. I kind of still see that as a current path. And then there's also the kind of alternate path of trying to pursue a sort of polyglotism where I reach a very, extremely close to a near native level of Japanese. Then maybe I learn Chinese, maybe even another language. And now I am able to function at a near native level in 3 or 4 different languages. And that would be a very impressive achievement in and of itself. And those are 2 paths that before I was very interested in. But honestly, now I'm not that interested in them anymore. I've kind of, gone far enough on my Japanese path where I can see what it would be like to continue down the path. And instead of doing that, I'd rather do something new and fresh and challenging. And so really, Japanese will always be a big part of my life, but I'm just not pulled in that direction anymore. I'm not that interested by Japan and Japanese. All the things I am interested in mostly exist in English, and so really, I mean, maybe I'll go to Japan at some point. I'm not against it, but I just don't see any inherent reason to in the way that the question kind of assumes. It doesn't. It just kind of seems like, well, you asked why don't you move to Japan? My question is, well, why would I? And you do give the reason it would help you in your language and MI endeavors, but like I said, you said if I went to Japan, I would become more motivated to study Japanese. But you see, that's kind of a backwards way to think about it, is because this is your implicit logic. I should be motivated, but I'm not. So I will take action to get motivated. But in my view, if you're not motivated, then you're not motivated. And why try to become motivated, right? I don't really view me reaching a native level accent in Japanese as any kind of inherent good, right? Japanese people, like if we're just talking about accent, for example, right? Yeah, my accent isn't perfect, but if there would be no practical difference to my life or anyone else's life if I was able to sound completely Japanese, right? Japanese people aren't going to care. They're still going to view me as a foreigner. I'm still going to be a foreigner. It might be a little bit more pleasant to talk to me, but not a significant amount. And most of all, think of the opportunity cost, right? Let's say it would take me another 2,000 hours, just arbitrarily, to perfect my accent in Japanese. Imagine all the other things I could do in those 2,000 hours. I could learn an entirely different skill. I could gain a large amount of knowledge and understanding on a completely new topic. And it really seems like those things are going to help me contribute to society at large more than me just sitting and grinding out pronunciation in Japanese, right? And so I guess I've just reached a point where I feel like, in terms of the big picture of my life, Japanese has given me a lot, but for the most part, it's already given me most of what it has to offer, and I'm ready to move on to something else. And so I don't really see... I feel that me becoming less motivated to grind out Japanese and somehow reach a higher and higher level, my loss in interest in that is actually, I think, a sign of my own growth more than anything else, because I'm kind of transcending this really limited paradigm that I was stuck in for a long time of viewing language ability as the end-all, be-all of life and my value as a human. And so I don't really feel that I should try to become more motivated. That would be a very backwards thing to do. The fact that I'm having less motivation, I think, is a sign of growth. It's allowing me to open up to new possibilities of ways I can use my time and energy that will perhaps become more beneficial to other people. So, and then you also mentioned MIA endeavors. Well, I also don't really see how me living in Japan would help my MIA endeavors, because what my job is, regarded to MIA, is work on yoga to make innovative new types of apps and programs and add-ons that will make the language learning process more efficient than it has ever been before. Educate myself on language acquisition through study and reading and also my own direct experience, so that I'm able to have the deepest possible understanding of language acquisition, and then write articles and texts and create videos that help other people understand my knowledge and my own understanding. And I don't really think me living in Japan is going to have any significant influence on any of those, right? Because, I mean, me working with yoga to make add-ons, that's not going to matter if I'm in Japan or not, except there'll be a time zone difference, so that would make it harder to collaborate, but that's not that big of an issue. Reading up on language acquisition, that's completely location independent as long as I have the internet, so that wouldn't matter. And creating video content and written content, again, that's not going to matter whether I'm in Japan or not. Sorry if the leaf blower or lawnmower outside is loud. It's whenever I try to film, someone has to mow their lawn. It's really unfortunate. I'm already this far into the video. So I guess I still do continue to study Japanese for a little bit every day, but really I think I have enough experience for me to be able to make MIA exactly what I want it to be, right? Even though I haven't reached the highest level that I could reach in Japanese, realistically, I've already reached a higher level than most people are ever going to even bother to try to reach, and I still see the path if I wanted to get better. I know what I'd have to do. I can still give a lot of advice related to that. And perhaps you could argue that me not reaching native level in Japanese is limiting MIA because I won't be able to give firsthand experiential instruction on how to reach native level. And I think that's a valid point. But at the same time, only a tiny fraction of people are going to come to the point that I'm at now and still feel motivated to spend hundreds of hours of their life trying to improve their language ability. And also, once you get to the point that I'm at now, it's like you kind of understand how this process works. You're kind of self-sufficient. You get how to finish the process, and at the same time, mostly I don't think it's worth it for me. And so maybe someone else will come along and they'll reach native level, and then they'll create a new version of MIA with its own name, or maybe expand on MIA or something, and then that will be an even better. So, I came along, I learned from AJAT, I absorbed its wisdom, I applied it to gain lots of benefit. I also added on to it with my own study and experience and made it even better. And I think someone might come along after, benefit from my additional experience and wisdom, and make something even better than MIA. And I think if that happens, that'd be really great. That'd be perfect. And so I kind of feel that for the contribution that I have in mind to the language learning world, I already have enough experience to create that. And so really, I don't view me going to Japan and spending lots of hours trying to improve my Japanese ability as really relevant to MIA. In fact, it would actually probably take time away from MIA, because if I wanted to improve my Japanese, that would take a lot of my time and energy. And right now I'm putting most of my time and energy into MIA. And so really those things are completely separate, right? Me getting better at my own languages is completely separate than me working on MIA. And the activities that those things consist of are completely mutually exclusive. And so, or not mutually exclusive, but they're just completely unrelated to each other. And so, I don't really view me going to Japan as related to my MIA endeavors at all. And I don't really have any language endeavors anymore, so that's not really relevant either. So hopefully that answered your question. If not, feel free to clarify now that you've heard some more of my perspective. So Sevi asks, if you had a significant other that spoke your target language and they wanted to help you learn, would you... Oh, let me just restart. If you had a significant other that spoke your target language and they wanted to help you learn, how would you instruct them to teach you? What would you ask them to avoid doing? Assuming you're at the beginner phase, but advice for advanced learners would be interesting to hear. So, first of all, I just want to say I'd be very hesitant to try to make my significant other into a language teacher, right? That has, I think, the potential to put a lot of strain and stress on the relationship, and I don't really know if you want to risk that, right? One of the most fundamental foundations of a relationship is communication, and if you try to bring in languages that you don't speak very well as a big component of your relationship, then you risk putting strain on communication, which therefore might put a lot of strain on your relationship as a whole. And so, personally, I would probably try to mostly keep things separate, at least until I was very advanced in the language. But to answer your question more directly, I would say in the beginning phase, really the only thing they can do for you is answer questions that you happen to come across, right? Because them speaking to you in their native language and your target language, let's just say for the sake of this example so that it's easy to know who I'm talking about, that you are speaking Japanese and, man, that's so noisy, it sucks, that you are a native English speaker learning Japanese, and your wife, I'm just saying that because I'm a male and I'm imagining if it was my significant other, and I'm straight, so if my wife was Japanese and she wanted to teach me Japanese, let's just say that's a scenario, well, at the beginning, her speaking Japanese to me isn't going to really be very productive because I'm not going to understand very much Japanese yet, right? And so, of course, it's going to make good listening practice, but she probably doesn't want to talk to you just for the sake of you getting listening practice, right? If she's talking to you, that's probably because she's trying to communicate with you, right? And so that's just going to be frustrating if she's trying to communicate things with you, you're not understanding half of what she's saying, maybe you're not even understanding 1% of what she's saying. That is just not productive at all and going to be very frustrating, so I can't do that. And then, of course, you can't speak Japanese either because you're not going to be ready to output. So really, in the beginning, all you can really benefit from is, let's say that you're immersing on your own and you come up with this word and you have some question like, wait, in this case, does this mean A or B? Or what's the difference between like this and that? And of course, you don't need someone to answer these questions. If you just keep on going and keep on immersing, then these questions will naturally resolve themselves. And also, you could just Google it as well. But hey, if you have your wife right there and she's willing to help you, then you can get instant gratification to that by getting all your answers, all your questions answered right on the spot. So yeah, if she's willing to do that, you could do that. Maybe that would be useful. If you get to a more intermediate level where you're actually pretty decent at understanding, then perhaps you can have your wife, in this case, your Japanese wife, start speaking to you in Japanese more of the time. And in this scenario, you would still speak back in English. So she's speaking in Japanese, you speak back in English. And this might seem like it would be weird if you haven't done it before, but it's actually not weird at all. I've had many Japanese friends in the past that we communicated in this fashion. I would speak, because they were pretty good at English, I was pretty good at Japanese, so I would just speak in English, they'd speak back in Japanese, we'd understand each other, we'd be able to express ourselves as naturally as possible, and after the first 5 minutes, it's actually extremely natural and really cool. So that's what I would probably try to move into once you get a decent grasp on understanding. But whenever you want to talk about something really fundamental and important, maybe you don't want to be doing that in Japanese because you don't, want to risk missing something, misunderstanding something. If you're talking about something important, probably just keep it in the language that you're both most comfortable in. And so, yeah. So things like where you're going to go for lunch or just talking about your day, maybe she can speak to you in Japanese. And then once you get more advanced and you actually start being able to output, then you can start actually just communicating only in Japanese as much as possible. When you're not sure about how to say something, then you can switch back to English and maybe she could tell you how she would say that thing in Japanese. And she can correct you occasionally. Probably you don't want to try to get too much corrections just because that also is going to put a lot of strain on your relationship. It doesn't feel good to get corrected, no matter how much you know that you shouldn't take it personally and that it's helping you, right? Still, if you're a human being and you're not enlightened, then it just doesn't feel shitty to have someone point out that you were wrong, even if it's like, it just doesn't feel good, right? It doesn't feel good to be wrong. It makes you feel incompetent. And so I wouldn't, and also it's really annoying and tedious to try to correct other people's mistakes, and it also can just get awkward. So, your significant other probably isn't really going to enjoy trying to correct all your mistakes. And so I would say maybe at the beginning, try to mostly hold off on getting corrections, except for things that you really do repeatedly, right? If you're making the same mistake repeatedly, then maybe try to get corrections. And over time, as you get better, you can ask her to, and remember in this case, just Japanese wife scenario, but whoever your significant other is, can ask them to get, maybe over time more strict about their corrections, and to the point where, anything they notice that's weird, they can point it out. And maybe as your relationship develops and you get used to this, then it'll become less awkward to have your mistakes pointed out and point them out, and it will become more natural. So that could be cool. So that could be pretty beneficial. And I guess that's how I would go about it. Yeah, but I would always remember that relationship should come first before language learning, and drop the whole language learning, helping you with a language game whenever things get serious, because you don't want that extra strain on your relationship. But that's mostly what I would say. The other thing I'll just add on here is that a lot of people, this isn't really relevant at all, but it just popped into my mind and I want to say it. When I'm arguing with people about input before output, something that I hear all the time is the person is arguing that they're doing early output and it's beneficial and not harmful. And when I say, well, you're going to make lots of bad habits, their rebuttal is, oh, well, actually my wife or my friend so-and-so corrects every single mistake I make, therefore I'm not going to make any bad habits. But this is completely delusional. There's no way they're pointing out all of your mistakes, because unless you have been immersing for 2 years and you are actually ready to output genuinely, you're going to be making countless mistakes every single sentence. If you count grammar, just how natural your phrasing is, your pronunciation, if you take all of that into account, there's no way that you're not making multiple mistakes per sentence, and there's no way they're pointing that all out to you, right? They're pointing out the most egregious mistakes, and all the other stuff is just, they're letting it go. And if you think this is not the case, you're very naive. So I just wanted to point that out, that really, if natives are going to be strict on you and say everything that deviates from perfection, they are going to point out, until you reach a very high level, you would be getting corrected every single sentence, probably multiple times. And if you're not getting corrected at that rate, then assume that they're letting a lot of stuff go. And so that is the reality. Don't rely too much on native speakers. They might tell you you're perfect. They might tell you that you sound like you're Japanese, but they're lying. That's just a thing that Japanese people do. They don't have any harmful intention. That's just their way of being nice and, expressing that they're very impressed with your Japanese. They don't really realize that actually it might be harmful to tell people that they're better than they really are, and that might actually impede their growth. So they don't have any bad intentions, but they are lying when they tell you that you're perfect and amazing, and they don't actually think you're that good, and you're probably not. When you really get good, they actually are probably not going to speak about your Japanese ability at all. And if you do ask them, then they're actually more likely to say, oh, well, actually, yeah, everything sounded really normal and natural, except when you said this thing that sounded kind of weird. That's probably the feedback you'll get when you truly approach perfection, right? Because they stop viewing you as a learner and they start viewing you as just an equal. And once that happens, then your occasional mistakes actually stick out a lot more, and they're probably actually going to be more willing to point those things out. The same way that native speakers point out mistakes to each other pretty readily. So, that's what I'd say on that. So Oliver Eckhart asks, do you think it's easier to achieve a near native level in Korean than in Japanese? So I can't really answer this because I don't feel that I know enough about Korean or learning Korean. So, I mean, in the case of Mandarin Chinese, if you're a native English speaker, then I can say with confidence that reaching a near native level in Japanese is significantly more difficult than reaching a near native level in Mandarin Chinese. And I've talked about why that is in the past. But I don't know enough about Korean to be able to make that sort of claim. Now, so with that said, everything I say about, beyond this point is completely speculation. I could totally be wrong, so don't take it too seriously. But I would say that I would speculate that they're probably, for a native English speaker, Japanese and Korean are probably quite similar, just given that the grammar I know is very similar. They also have politeness hierarchies and things like that. They both were very influenced by Chinese historically and have a lot of the shared type of vocabulary and things like that. And so overall, I would say it's probably a similar level of difficulty, but I know that Korean, for the most part, doesn't use kanji anymore. So that's something that you're going to have to deal with in Japanese, not in Korean. And that also isn't too big because reaching a Japanese level of kanji proficiency is not that hard in the big scheme of things. But I'm pretty sure that most dialects of Korean don't have pitch accent, so that's another thing that is going to make it a lot easier. But there could be other difficulties that Korean presents that I'm just not aware of that don't exist in Japanese. Like, for example, I'm pretty sure the politeness hierarchy system is even more complex and strict in Korean than in Japanese. So perhaps that would pose difficulty. So I would say that probably they're very similar, but Japanese is still a notch or two more difficult to reach in your native level. But I'm not confident in that because I don't know that much about about Korean. So Victor Lecomte asks, hi Matt, do you have any updated timeline for MIA V1? Thanks in advance. So basically MIA V1 was this idea that how I realized that writing the type of well thought out, polished articles that I want to write for the MIA table of contents takes a lot of time and effort on my part. And I actually realized that there's a lot of things that I want to research ahead of time before writing a lot of the articles that I want to write. And so basically I view it taking me a long time to finish populating the contents of the MIA table of contents. But at the same time, there's currently a lot of people who want to get started with MIA right now, yet there's this lack of clear information about how to go about actually executing it. And so as a solution to this, I came up with this idea to make a quick and dirty version of the table of contents, known as MIA V1, just to simply get some basic information out there so that people have enough to really get going. And then after that's out there, I can start working slowly and steadily on creating MIA V2, which would be the finished, polished version with articles that would cite all the sources that I was inspired by and have a lot of research and thought put into and really polished up. And so this was the idea. What MIA V1 was going to consist of is these kind of short, off-the-cuff, quick and dirty videos on various topics, because I already have this list of all the main topics that I want to cover and a rough idea of what I want to talk about on each of those topics. So I figured I could just, every day turn on the camera, look at the list of things I want to talk about, choose a topic, and then just talk about it for 10-15 minutes, upload that onto the table of contents, and I could just go through the list of all the things I want to cover until I'd covered them all, and that would be MIV1. And so I made a video talking about this plan, and most people seemed that they thought it was a good idea. But when I actually started creating MIV1, I realized that making those quick and dirty videos is much more difficult than I imagined. If I actually try to just look at the topic, turn on the camera, and ramble, to express the idea, it would take me much longer than 10-15 minutes. If I didn't plan it out ahead of time and sit and structure my argument, and I'm really just kind of thinking as I go, then it will probably end up being a half an hour to 45 minutes long, per video, and they would be very all over the place, very messy, very hard to follow, because I'll just start talking, and then I'll realize, oh, there's this other thing I forgot in the beginning, and let me think of an example, and it would just be very all over the place and hard to follow and bloated, and no one would want to sit through that. And I just realized that if the whole table of contents was filled with these bloated, messy videos, that would just look so bad for MIA. And people who go to the website, they'd just be like, who is this blabbering buffoon, and why should I listen to him? And so I just couldn't get myself to upload that level of low quality videos. And so what I ended up doing for each video was thinking about what I wanted to say ahead of time, coming up with all the points, structuring them into a kind of logical argument, coming up with examples, and then recording that, and I'd end up having to film it a bunch of times until I was satisfied with it. And that would normally take many times over an hour just to film the 10 to 15 minute video, because I just couldn't articulate it the way that I wanted to, and it'd be really frustrating. And then I'd give it to my editor to like cut out the verbal flaws and things like that. And so anyway, it just ended up taking a lot longer to make one of these MIV1 videos than I would have thought. And I made probably close to 10 of them, but a lot of times it would take me 3 hours to make one of those videos. And so I was going to try to make 1 or 2 every day, but I realized 1 a day is pretty much the max, because I have other MIA work I need to do. I spend a lot of time planning add-ons with yoga. I spend a lot of time actually having to make, main channel videos, and also working with people in the server, and also doing my own research. And so it was really hard it ended up really being difficult to make those MIV1 videos. And so I ended up kind of just falling off, because it felt like it felt like a bad deal for me, because they're supposed to be these quick and dirty videos. They're not as polished as I would like. They're not as good as a main channel video, yet they still take a lot of effort. So it kind of felt like this chuto hampa, if you know that Japanese word, kind of like in between, where it wasn't quick and dirty, and it wasn't polished like a main channel video. And so it wasn't that satisfying. But I do plan on following through, going back. I kind of fell off just because what happened was, if you saw the video called Language Isn't Math, that was originally going to be an MIA V1 video. And then I realized, if I actually edited this and polished it up, it has the potential to be a main channel video. And I spent a lot of time polishing it. Like, I spent probably 10 hours editing the video, and then I was really happy with it and really liked that video. And then I just it felt like, man, I would rather make these type of videos than the quick and dirty ones, because it's like, it almost feels like a waste of potential, right? Like, if I would have just uploaded the Languages Math video without editing it, yeah, the message would have still gotten across, but it wouldn't have been as impactful. And so it feels like a waste to take these videos that have so much potential and then turn them, not actualize all that potential by editing it, right? But overall, I still, and so that's basically why I ended up going like a month and a half without making any MIV1 videos. And then I also went on the meditation retreat, and that kind of threw me off. And so that happened, but I still plan on getting back to finishing MIAV1. I think I'm going to work on improving my workflow, not being so OCD and perfectionist about the quality. I mean, I'm not going to make it as bad as I'm not going to put those bloated 30 to 40 minute videos out, but I'm just going to try to improve my workflow improve just my meta skill of making these videos and of being articulate and talking and formulating my ideas. So hopefully I'll get quicker and quicker at it. I want to, from starting this next week, hopefully make at least 4 per week, 4 to 5. And at that pace, it should take me, less than a few months to populate MIV1. So that's the plan. Sorry to not follow through with my initial kind of claim that I was going to just blow this out. But hopefully you understand my point of view, and I do plan on following through. I'm not going to drop this. I know that there's been a lot of projects that I talked about and then ended up not following through on, and I feel really regretful about those things. I really don't want to have a reputation of saying stuff and not following through, so I definitely plan on following through with MIV1. So please stick with me, guys. And I do apologize that it's been slow. I am trying to improve on that. So Muhammad W asks, to clarify my last question, which was, how should I learn Japanese if I don't care about output abilities? Is it more efficient to learn to read Japanese before developing listening abilities? My thinking is that when I want to improve my listening ability, I will already have a large vocabulary and understanding of the structures and grammar of Japanese. Also, how would one go about reading as a beginner? Is watching something with Japanese subtitles the best way to start? So I'm pretty sure. So basically, to give context, in the last Q&A, this guy, Muhammad W, asked the question, like he said, how should I go about learning Japanese? How should I modify the MIA timeline for my specific situation, which is that I only care about comprehension and I don't care about output. And so now he's basically asking the same question. So I already answered the question he's asking right now in the last Q&A, but I must have not been clear enough, or maybe he wasn't paying attention because he asked the same thing I already said. But what I said in that other video that I'm just going to repeat now and try to be more clear is that, the basic premise that I've said in many different videos multiple times is that as an adult language learner, learning how to read a language is much easier than learning how to listen to that language or to develop listening comprehension. And if you can already read, then developing listening comprehension is going to be much easier than it would be if you couldn't read, because, like Muhammad said in his question, you're already going to have this basic understand or a deep understanding of how the grammar works, what words mean, and all this. That it's just a matter of being able to hear it and process it in real time, right? So yes, if you're only concerned with raw efficiency, learning how to read and then learning how to listen after that is, for the most part, the quickest approach. But the other thing you have to think about is that if you let your reading abilities get too far ahead of your listening abilities, then going back and catching up your listening abilities is going to really become a painful chore, because you're going to be used to feeling that you're good at Japanese, that you can understand Japanese, yet then you're going to be watching some basic anime or something that you know is filled with really easy language, yet you're still going to be missing more than half of it. And that's going to be very frustrating and painful. And so I've actually seen this happen to many people where they get really good at reading, their listening abilities still suck because they never practice active listening, and they kind of just keep putting it off. They're like, oh, well, I'll just get a little better at reading, then I'll go and start listening. Oh, I'll just get a little better. I'm still not perfect at reading yet. And they basically just put it off forever. And this is a easy trap to fall into. And so what I said in the last video is that yes, because learning to read before listening is going to be more efficient, then you should take a very reading-heavy approach. You should also have some amount of listening, because you don't want the gap between your listening and your reading to get too big. It's exactly what I said in the last video, and it is answering your question. So what I would do is take an approach that's maybe 3/4, thinking about immersion time, 3/4 reading, 1/4 listening. So maybe just at least actively watch one episode of anime a day, just because that's going to help your listening abilities not fall too far behind. And also, that little bit of listening probably is going to help your reading, because it's going to be easier to learn to read Japanese if you know what Japanese is supposed to sound like. Otherwise, you have to make up your own, verbal version of the language in your head, and that's going to be more difficult to do than just getting the real thing. And ultimately, the main reason why I don't advise people in general to take an approach that's too reading heavy is because it has the potential to greatly damage your pronunciation. And that's why I recommend most people to take at least a 50-50 approach. But if you don't care about output, therefore you don't care about pronunciation, I would say, yeah, maybe take a 3/4 reading approach, but still have some active listening, because otherwise that gap is going to get really big, and I don't think it's going to be worth it. And I think that a little bit of listening is going to help your reading as well. And also do passive listening, because you can't passively read, you can only passive listen, so it's just free benefit, right? It's like, why not? So hopefully that answers your question clearly this time. And then what's the best way to go about reading as a beginner? I would say, yeah, watching things with target language subtitles is probably the best way to get started with reading, because at the beginning there's going to be lots of stuff you don't know, right? That's just the reality. And the thing is, it's a lot easier to be okay with missing lots of stuff if it's a visual medium with subtitles than an actual book. Because if it's an actual book, all the words are there on the page. If you want to, you can look up every single word. You can Google every grammar expression. You can ask a native to help explain any sentence you want to you. And effectively, you could spend all day reading one single page of a book and reach a decent understanding of it. But this isn't an efficient way to go about learning how to read. An efficient way to learn about going how to read is to just plow through some material, skip all the stuff that is way too hard, focus on the stuff that you can understand and that you can almost understand, I+1 stuff, and over time, you'll slowly fill in all the holes, and the picture, it'll become clearer and clearer. And so basically, it's much easier to develop this type of mindset if you are watching with subtitles, because the pacing is built into the thing, right? If you're watching an anime episode's 20 minutes, right? Whether you understand it or not, it's 20 minutes. And of course, you probably are going to be pausing if you're watching with subtitles, because I would recommend that every once in a while you pause, look something up, think about a structure. And, if you want to know how often should I be looking something up, I have a video called How Often Should I Look Things Up? So you can search that on YouTube. But for the most part, it's easy to be okay with missing lots of stuff. And also there's the visuals that keep you engaged and so on. And so I would say, yeah, watching with subtitles is a good way to break into reading, so to speak, and to get comfortable with skipping stuff and focusing on what's in reach and the low-hanging fruit. But at the same time, after a certain point, you are going to have to let go of that and dive into true written material, whether that's a manga or a light novel or whatever. And the first time you do this, it is going to be very difficult. Because at the end of the day, when you're watching something with Japanese subtitles or first language subtitles, you're getting information that you wouldn't have if you were just reading the script, right? You get the intonation patterns. You're hearing it being spoken, and when you hear the language being spoken, that gives your brain a lot of clues as to how to parse the sentence, right? When you intonation patterns basically give you lots of information of word boundaries, structure boundaries, what part of the sentence is talking about what other part of the sentence, what is being emphasized, what is not. And so you have this whole realm of information that helps you understand that is not going to be there if you're just reading a paper book, right? If you open up a manga, there's no intonation patterns, and so suddenly a lot of people will experience, why is this so hard to understand? They're saying the same things they say in anime, yet I can't parse it. Like, what does this mean? And so that is pretty much inevitable, having this experience of finding it very difficult to parse and understand things when you first jump into 100% text medium. But the only way that you're gonna get through this and push past that is by actually doing the task at hand, by actually reading. And so after a certain point, you're gonna have to just pick up a manga, pick up a light novel, and start reading. And you're not going to understand very much. It's going to take forever. It might take you a long time to read one page. Your understanding might be super blurry. You might have pretty much no idea what kind of story is taking place. But if you just push through it, by the time you finish your first manga volume or your first light novel, you'll have improved so much that you'll have pretty much figured out how this whole learning how to read thing works, right? You'll realize like, oh, the more you read, the better you get at reading. The more words you learn, the more you understand. And it's kind of just the same process that I've been through, but I just continued on until I'm fluent. And so I would say, don't wait until you're comfortable to start reading, because the only way you're going to get comfortable is by actually reading. And it's going to be uncomfortable at the beginning. This is something everyone goes through. It's completely inevitable. So you might as well just cut the cord relatively early and jump into the deep end of the pool and let your brain figure it out. So I would say, yeah, learning how to read, in a sense, is difficult. it's more like it feels difficult. Really, it's not, because all you have to do is just sit down with a book and keep turning the pages. But it feels difficult, and that's inevitable. Don't let that discourage you. Everyone goes through that. Aim to finish one whole book, and by the time that happens, you'll probably have figured it all out. So Matt vs. Japanglish asks, rather than learning words as they appear in our immersion, what do you think about learning a group of words at the same time? For example, let's say I really enjoy astronomy. Is it okay to learn the name of all the planets at once? Or would you say, wait for them to naturally appear in our immersion? I figured if I always learn them all at once in the beginning, it'll make diving into the new topic a lot easier for me. As always, thanks. So real quick, this is just a little pet peeve of mine. The question was asked, is it okay to learn the names of all the planets at once? So the language here implies that there's somehow some things are okay to do, some things are not okay to do, and I am somehow the arbiter of what is okay and not okay. When in reality, that's not the case at all, right? It's okay to do anything you want, especially if it's not harming anyone else, right? And so it's not up to me to say, is it okay to do this or not do this, right? That's completely up to you. So I would prefer if people didn't ask questions that imply that somehow I am some arbiter of truth, or at least have some direct access to some sort of truth, and I need to relay that to you. Whatever I say, it's just my opinion. It's just my view on things. It's not the ultimate truth, and you can do whatever the heck you want, right? If something, even if something goes against what I say, if it makes sense to you and you're really curious about it, then maybe give it a go, and maybe you'll realize experientially that I was right, and you'll understand why I gave the advice that I gave, and if so, great. Now you learn something more. Now you have a deeper experiential understanding, and maybe you'll realize that I was wrong and it works out great for you, and in that case, great too, because hey, now you just figured out something cool that you wouldn't have figured it out otherwise. So of course, in general, I recommend taking my advice, otherwise I wouldn't give it, right? I'm trying to save you guys a lot of time, not repeating mistakes that I and many others have made. But don't be too dogmatic about it, and don't forget that at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. So I know that you already understand this, but I'm just saying, it's a little nitpicky thing, I know, but it's just my pet peeve, and I would prefer if people ask questions in terms of what would you recommend? Would you recommend this? What do you think about this? Would you advise or suggest this? And so on. But anyway, I would say your question is pretty context dependent. There's not one blanket answer. I would say that there are certain situations in which learning things out of context in a set are more efficient. And the cases where this would be true is when basically what you're learning does exist as a set of information. And therefore, learning it all at once actually helps you, makes things more efficient because you're learning things in relation to the other things in the set. So for example, at one point, I learned all the prefectures in Japan. I made 100 Anki cards. 50 of them were just, it would just show a map of Japan and then have a dot on one of the prefectures, and it would say, what is this prefecture? And then another one that had a blank map of Japan and would say, where is Yamanashi prefecture, for example. And so I had those two cards for every prefecture, and I memorized them all at once. I mean, not in one day, but I did like 10 of those a day until I finished that deck. And the reason why I think this was a good way to go about it is because I learned the prefectures in relation to themselves in a way, right? Like I learned, okay, so this is Tokyo, Kanagawa's right under Tokyo, Saitama's on top of Tokyo, Gunma's over here, and then Chiba's over here, blah blah blah, and then these are all the Kanto region. And so basically, because I was learning them in one sitting, so to speak, or all at once, I was able to learn them in relationship to each other. And I remember, okay, yeah, Tokyo's on top of Kanagawa, Kanagawa's under Tokyo. And this made it easier to remember. Whereas I think if I would learn it out of context, and I just randomly learned, oh, this one's Tokyo, randomly, oh, that one's Yamanashi, it could lead to memory interference, because when, for example, there's like similar prefectures that have, like there's like Fukuoka and then Fukushima, right? And so you got to keep those separate. But and so if I learn them out of context, I might have just, first you learn, like, let's just say Fukushima, and then you're like, okay, Fukushima's here, and then later you learn Fukuoka, and it's here, and then like one day you wake up and you hear Fukushima, and you're like, wait, was that one or that one? Because you never learn to tell them apart. But if you learn them at once, you realize, okay, there's two ones with Fukushima. There's two prefixes with Fuku in it. This one is Shima, this one is Oka, and then maybe you can make a mnemonic to help you keep them separate. And so in that way, it can help you avoid memory interference, because if there's any things that you would potentially confuse, you can come up with a mnemonic on the spot that will help you keep them separate. And like I said, you learn them in relationship to each other. So basically, things that come in a set, like a limited set, I would say that it perhaps might be a good idea to learn them out of context in a set, because you can learn them in relationship to each other. But besides that, I would say generally it's a good idea to learn things as they come up. But for example, I would say there's two different possible scenarios that we can think about for your question, right? You said, okay, I really enjoy astronomy and I want to do that in Japanese. So if we're talking about scenario 1, which is that you already are very familiar with astronomy in English, right? You know all the names of all the relevant concepts and ideas. You understand how they fit together. You're pretty familiar with the types of things that are talked about related to astronomy. Then really, you already know astronomy. You just need to learn how to talk about it in Japanese. And if this is your situation where you are familiar with astronomy in English, you have a strong foundation of general Japanese ability, then learning how to talk about and understand astronomy in Japanese is going to be very easy, because you already have mental dictionary entries for all the concepts, right? If you're talking about a actual discipline like astronomy, then there's going to be one-to-one correlates between all the concepts between Japanese and English. Like, for example, kase means Mars, and they mean the exact same thing because they're a scientifically defined term in a way, right? And so it's not like verbs or nouns or these type of things that don't have one-to-one correlates, right? Like onnanoko. There's no English word that means the exact same thing as onnanoko. Or hashiru. There's no English word that means the exact same thing as hashiru. Run is close, but it's different in many ways as well. And so this is why it's important to use the monolingual dictionary to glean things through context, to not take the English translation too seriously. But if we're talking about an actual discipline, like not just scientific, but even if it was talking about a sport, right, or something like that, where there's these like defined concepts that relate to the activity that have been honed over time, then there are going to be one-to-one correlates. And so really you already know all the Japanese words related to astronomy, you just don't know how to say them yet in a weird way, right? And also, if you know kanji and you have a basic understanding of Japanese, then it's going to be extra easy because the kanji are just going to make perfect sense, right? Like kase, fire star, right? Or fire planet. It's going to be very easy to remember. And so I don't think you need to learn all the concepts ahead of time. You just, need to dive in, right? Just find an interesting looking article and then just start reading it. And there'll be words you don't know, but you can look them up and be like, oh, this means Mars. And then it'll instantly click and be like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. And you won't probably need to SRS anything, right? You can just remember them because you already have the mental dictionaries entries from English and you have the fundamental Japanese ability. So drawing the connection is going to be very quick, right? So if you just, read a few articles here and there, you could probably pick it all up really quickly. And so I would say in that case, you probably don't need to SRS anything, let alone sit and learn all the concepts out of context. I would say that's going to be a much slower path in the end. The quicker path is just jump in, learn them in context. You're going to pick it up very quickly. The other possibility, scenario 2, is that you actually are not familiar with astrology or astronomy. Astrology is something different. You've never studied it before. You don't know any of the concepts or ideas or related objects. And so you don't have any English mental dictionaries to go off of. So in this case, basically, you wouldn't just jump into reading detailed articles about specific ideas in astronomy, right? You would probably either go on the Wikipedia page of just astronomy, where it wouldn't assume any knowledge, and you could just read from the beginning, or you could buy a book like Intro to Astronomy, or some book written for a general audience about astronomy. And if you buy that type of book, then they're not going to assume that you know any of the astronomy-specific words, right? They're actually going to explain what they mean in the book. They're going to say, well, first of all, there's this idea of uchu, it's space, And space is actually defined like this. And there are these things called planets, and planets are actually defined as this. And the planets are a blah, 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 blah. And so basically you're not going to need to learn them ahead of time because it's just going to explain it to you in the book, right? And in this case, if you're actually learning about astronomy in Japanese for the first time, then really you're not learning Japanese anymore. You're just learning astronomy. And it just happens to be in Japanese, right? You're doing the same thing a Japanese person would be doing if a Japanese person wanted to learn about astronomy. And so in a way, just think about, well, if you wanted to tackle a new subject in English, what would you do? You probably wouldn't make any SRS cards, realistically, right? You would probably just start reading material about it, listening to content related to it, and then you'd slowly, pick up things here and there, put the picture together, right? And so I'd say, because if you are consuming material meant for people who are not already familiar with the subject, they're going to teach you everything as you go along, then there's no need to memorize a bunch of terms out of context, right? So basically, to conclude, I would say that for things that come in sets, like for example the planets, if you're just talking about you want to memorize the planets in our solar system, that might be a good thing to just make Anki cards for and memorize, because you're memorizing them in relationship to each other. Things like prefixes, locations, also maybe like the periodic table of elements, maybe that would be a good thing to just sit down and memorize or make Anki cards for. But besides those things that come in a limited set and are good to learn out of context because you're learning them in relationship to each other, for the most part, either if you're familiar with the topic in English or another language, then just jump in and start reading articles. You'll pick it up quickly. If not, then buy a book related or actually written for a general audience, for beginners, and it will teach you all the concepts as you go, pretty much making something like studying things out of context through Anki irrelevant. So hopefully that answers your question. So I Am Me asks, when switching to all Japanese in your media, where you still don't understand a majority, trying to avoid English chat rooms and such, how to prevent feeling lonely, and what to do once you already feel lonely. Is it hard to make connections when you can't understand it is hard to make connections when you can't understand or make yourself understood. Did you ever have that problem? What did you do? So, just to talk about my personal experience first. So, I would say when I was in Japan, I experienced a lot of loneliness. And I think this was because I couldn't see my family. I couldn't talk to my family very often. I couldn't talk of any of my real friends. And then, of course, I couldn't have any meaningful relationships or connections to any of the Japanese people there. Or, I mean, maybe I potentially could have, but I didn't. And so I felt very lonely and isolated, and I got pretty depressed, and that is what led me to leave Japan early. But once I was back home studying Japanese, after that point, I never really experienced that much loneliness. And I think this was because, first of all, I would regularly spend time with family, and that, was very comforting and filled a lot of my social needs. And also, in general, I'm just a pretty intense introvert. I just have the preference to spend most time by myself. I get tired hanging out with other people. I get exhausted, and I kind of recharge my battery when I'm by myself. So it was easy for me to spend lots of time just watching anime with myself. But that's just my disposition. And if you are more of an extrovert, then it's going to be a lot more difficult for you. And so what I would say is that there's two main approaches you can take to dealing with loneliness, and I would recommend trying to take a combination of both. So the first one is try to increase your coping abilities with loneliness, right? Loneliness is a human emotion, right? We all experience it. It's a very normal thing. It's part of being human. So don't demonize yourself or feel guilty or feel bad about the fact that you feel lonely. You don't have any say in the matter. Your unconscious decides whether you feel lonely or happy or whatever. So if you feel lonely, you feel lonely. That's the reality. Nothing you can do about it. So you can just accept that, but and then maybe try to just be okay with it, right? Because really, loneliness is just a feeling in the mind, in the body, and you can train yourself to be able to just observe and be with the feeling of loneliness without it really bothering you too much or really causing you a lot of distress or suffering. And this is what a lot of meditation is about. It's just a skill that you can cultivate. And so I would recommend trying to cultivate this skill to some degree, because no matter who you are or what kind of life you live, you're going to go through periods where you have to deal with very difficult emotions, And so training your coping mechanisms and your coping abilities to so that you can handle negative emotions well and be effective and strong and functional in the face of difficult emotions. That's a very important life skill that's going to benefit you greatly for the rest of your life, no matter what you're doing. So I would definitely try to view loneliness under that perspective of every time you're feeling lonely or any negative emotion, most of the time people just wallow in it and immediately try to seek a way to make that feeling go away. But you can also view the negative emotion as an opportunity to train your coping abilities and to train your ability to feel happy unconditionally, regardless of what's going on in your internal or external life. And so trying to adopt that paradigm of, okay, I'm feeling lonely. Can I be okay with that? Can I sit with that? What does it feel like to be lonely? How strong is it? Is it getting stronger? Is it getting weaker? How does feeling lonely change the way I think about my life and my, all the things that I like to do and all these things like that. So if you try to get curious about it in that way and kind of investigate it and try to just actually gain some distance from the emotion, right? Not just identify, I am lonely, but view it more as loneliness is happening. What is that like? Then you can create some distance from that and be able to be with it and be okay with it. And so I would encourage you to try to adopt that way of thinking about it a little bit. But at the same time, it probably is important and healthy to take some actual action steps to ameliorate your loneliness, including spending more time with family, maybe spending more time with real life friends unrelated to Japanese, and perhaps making, like someone suggested in the comments, making some Japanese learning friends. I know that this isn't what Katsumoto said, but I'm of the mindset that learning a language isn't the most important thing in the world. It's not worth sacrificing your happiness in order to learn a language. That's a really bad trade-off, even if you do get good. And if you trade your happiness to get good, you're probably going to regret it later on, because being good at a language isn't probably going to crack up to be all that you're imagining, right? It's going to feel very normal and mundane once you actually achieve it. And so if you look back and say, wow, did I push myself through this miserable process just for this? You might feel that it wasn't going to be worth it, probably. And so I would say, like, yes, especially like family and close friends, that's more important than Japanese. Like, your connection to other human beings, that's where most of your value is going to, your true meaning and fulfillment is probably going to come from in life. And so I would say it's probably healthy and to put that above Japanese. And so, yeah, and then technically it would be, if all that mattered was Japanese, it'd be better to never talk to anyone and just immerse all day. But that's going to make you miserable. It's going against your human instincts. And so I don't think that's a healthy thing to do. I don't think you should do that. I think that you should make time for family, make time for friends, even if they're not Japanese related, because you're a human being. And I will say that I wouldn't recommend in the beginning trying to make Japanese friends, because if you're trying to speak Japanese and you suck still, then that's just going to be frustrating and pointless, because you're not going to understand what each other's saying. And if you find a Japanese person that speaks English, well, then really chances are they either are the type of Japanese person who doesn't even like Japan, and they are like, the reason why they're good at English is because they've spent so much time trying to escape it, right? Or they just want to get good at English, but they're not good yet, and then at which case you're pretty much just functioning as an English teacher for them, and that's not going to feel very good either. So I would say until you get good, probably don't try too hard to make Japanese friends. That's what I would recommend, honestly. At least not online. If you have real life Japanese friends who are good at English, then that could be pretty cool. And I had that when I first started learning Japanese. But like trying to look online for Japanese people who want to be friends with you, you're probably just going to end up finding people who want to learn English, and that's unlikely to turn into a real friendship. But I would say it can be very helpful and motivating to have other friends who are also language learners. And for a lot of my hardcore days, I did have a friend, Patrick and Dan, who were also equally serious about learning Japanese. And we would talk to each other about learning Japanese and our experiences. And of course, we knew that it wasn't ideal. We weren't being the perfect age-adders, because if we were, we wouldn't be talking to each other. But at the same time, I think we just had a recognition that we're humans, we have a desire to communicate and to share our experiences, And it was worth it for us. It was worth sacrificing an hour of immersion to talk for an hour about our experience and just connect with each other. And so I would say, yeah, it can be a very good thing, a very motivating and helpful thing to have other language learner friends. Just be careful about falling into the trap of spending too much time, talking about language learning with them and getting too dragged into it. So you got to make sure you have someone who's on the same page as you, yeah, we're friends, that's cool, but also it's important that we spend time on Japanese, and who's not going to get offended by you saying, okay, I'm going to get back to immersion now, right? So, but if you can find a good friend like that, which hopefully you will be able to in, my server, then I think that can be pretty beneficial. So I guess to summarize, work on being okay with your coping mechanisms with loneliness, actually increase the amount of interaction you have with other humans, and hopefully you'll end up being happy and still being able to get really good relatively quickly. So Genismit asks, I wonder if I'm the only one who thinks that Japanese fonts is too small, especially manga and blurry kanji and tiniest furigana. Do you think it's worth to decrease size of the text in the SRS and not use zoom that much just to practice reading small font sizes? How do you feel about size of the Japanese text now? So, yeah, I would agree with you that in general, Japanese fonts are smaller than English fonts. Actually, I don't know if the fonts are smaller. It might just be that kanji are more intricate, and so when they're the same size, the Japanese fonts feel smaller. But actually, if you look at older Japanese books, like that were published more than 30 years ago, the fonts were even smaller. Like, they were tiny. And if you look at really old Japanese books, like from 50 years ago, it actually, there's some books I have that just blow my mind. That it's like, people read this without a magnifying glass. Like, it's pretty unbelievable how small the texts were. And so compared to that, modern day Japanese texts are actually quite large, right? Like a lot of novels, like actually I can just show you. Let's see. So like, here's an older book that was published probably like 50 years ago, and it's a big book, right? It's a hardcover, and the font is this isn't the tiniest font I've seen, but it's pretty small. Whereas here is a modern bunkobon paperback, and so it's like way smaller, right, in every dimension. Yet the text is actually significantly larger and pretty easy on the eyes. And so this kind of book I actually feel isn't hard to read at all. The font's not that small. I do sometimes feel that the older books can be hard to read and it kind of strains your eyes. If you're talking about video games or the internet, that can also just be an issue of pixels, right? Like, I know I got a newer screen a couple months ago with higher resolution, and that made Japanese fonts on my computer look smaller. So I just started, like, on my browser making everything like 20% zoomed in, and that made it a lot easier to read. And, well, basically, to answer your question, I do think that maybe perhaps in general, Japanese font sizes are smaller, but I wouldn't say that it's a good idea to go out of your way to practice that, because first of all, if you can read Japanese in a huge font well, like fluently, then you're going to be able to read the small fonts automatically. And I can just say that from experience, because I never practiced reading with small fonts, but even now, like if I'm playing Dragon Quest, they have this super tiny pixelated font where half the strokes aren't even there in the kanji. I can still read what it says, because a lot of being able to read blurry handwritten stuff, fonts, is just your basically inferential abilities. It's your ability of your brain to fill in the blanks. And so if you've ever read like one of those paragraphs on Facebook where it's an English paragraph, but the letters within each word are jumbled around, yet, if you're a native speaker of English, you can still read it, right? Because when you look at a word, your brain isn't actually looking at each individual letter. It views the whole word as a single picture, a single piece. And when you're fluent in reading, that's what's going on, and that's why native speakers can read so quickly. And so the same thing happens with Japanese. And so if you get to the point where you can read fluently, then your brain's not looking at all the little strokes in the hiragana and all the little strokes in the kanji. It's viewing whole words as single units, single pictures. And once you get to that point, even if you're just practicing with huge fonts, then you're automatically going to be able to read the small fonts, because your brain is, like, even when you're reading the big fonts, your brain's not going to be looking at all the little lines anyway, Because if you are looking at all the little lines, that forces you to read super slowly. And if you are reading that slowly, that pretty much means that you're not very good at reading yet, which is fine. It's just a matter of more practice. So I would say don't practice reading smaller things. That's probably just going to make your eyes hurt and be bad for your eyes. It's not really going to help you improve any faster. If you actually get good at reading with zoomed in fonts and you actually get good, then you're automatically going to read the small fonts. And so maybe after you get to that point, you can practice reading small fonts to get even better at it. But overall, I would say just avoid small fonts in general because they're bad for your eyes. Like whenever you're kind of flexing your eyes so that you can see better, that is putting pressure on your eyes and it's going to make your eyesight deteriorate more quickly. So I would say in general, try to avoid that, right? And so I think it's good to read on a Kindle with huge font, read on the computer with huge font. I always do that. And I think Japanese looks more beautiful that way anyway. So anyway, yeah, I would say Japanese fonts probably are smaller in general, but don't try to read smaller fonts. It's not really going to do anything. So Asflug asks, "Hi Matt, good to see you are doing great. Yoga mentioned in a video with Luke Truman that going from 0 to 2,000 kanji is harder than going from 2,000 to 5,500. Do you agree with this statement?" Yeah, totally. The more kanji you learn, the easier it gets to learn more kanji because the more fluent your brain becomes in the meta language of kanji, right? Kanji are made up of the same like 200 basic components. So the more characters you learn, the more familiar you get with those components, and then the more effortless it becomes to learn new characters. So going from 1,000 to 2,000 is the hardest part. Going from going from 0 to 1,000 is the hardest part. Going from 1,000 to 2,000 is going to be easier. Going from 2,000 to 3,000 is going to be even easier. It just gets easier and easier. And then you eventually reach the point where you can just see a kanji once and then never forget it. So yeah, going from once you've learned 2,000 kanji, then you're pretty much, you're going to be pretty comfortable in the meta language of kanji. You know, your brain's going to be familiar with all the radicals. And so learning kanji after that point is going to be way easier. So yeah, I would agree with that statement. Anime Godfather asks, what do you think of the YouTube channel? There's a link posted. It's Laoshu's channel. If you know Laoshu 50500, Laoshu, it says, so what do you think of Laoshu's language learning method? I mean, I'm not too familiar with it, and I know enough to know that I'm not interested. So I'm not gonna go and watch a bunch of his videos and see what he actually says. But I know that he's very heavy on, I know that his thing is that he learns a little bit of a language. He studies some phrases, some grammar, some vocab, and then he just goes out there and talks to random people in the language. And I don't know if this is his main approach or whatever, but I mean, just by watching some of his videos, it seems that his goal is very different than the goal of people who are doing MIA, right? He's not trying to reach a high level of fluency. He's just trying to have some fun, right? And I think that's totally cool if that's your goal. If you're a native English speaker and you live in America, you don't need to learn any other language, right? It's pretty much just a hobby that you do for fun. And so if his hobby is learning a few words in a language to just see what it's like, and then he enjoys having these like really basic conversations with native speakers about normal stuff, then, all the power to him, right? And a lot of people are into that. That's perfectly cool. If you are actually trying to get to a high level of fluency, then I don't think that method is going to be effective at all, because it goes completely 180 degrees against everything that I talk about on my channel, right? All the, input before output is just, his output without sufficient input, it's just going to lead to super unnatural output. He's not going to understand very much. It's just going to be a disaster. And if you actually, I was watching one of his videos that blew up the other day, and he goes and talks to Japanese people in the supermarket, and his Japanese is awful. It's completely awful. You can completely tell that he's thinking in English and translating it into Japanese. Sometimes the native speakers can actually not understand him because his pronunciation is so bad, and then he can't understand what they're saying. And if you don't know any Japanese, maybe you could watch that conversation and be like, oh wow, look, he's communicating with them. But that would be completely falling for the fluency illusion. He's completely god-awful at Japanese. I don't really know about his other languages. I've heard he's really good at Chinese. I also heard that he's been studying Chinese for like 17 years. But yeah, I mean, judging if his method is what I think it is, which is basically, just Benny the Polyglot style, memorize some stuff and then go out and level up, then I would expect him to not be very good at his languages, and that appears to be the reality, right? So I would say if that's your goal, just to have some fun having broken conversations with native speakers, or just enjoy the intellectual pursuit of learning the basics of a language, maybe that's a good idea. But if you want to actually get fluent, I don't think that's the way to go. So Alex Rogers asks, "Hey Matt, I have a follow-up question to your video about word level pitch accent. You said it is mostly unambiguous to define pitch accent in terms of 4 patterns, and that in most cases, nakadaka words that are longer than 3 mora have multiple pronunciation variants. Could you talk about the cases where it would nevertheless be ambiguous? Do they occur completely randomly, or is there any pattern to it?" So, to a certain degree, it's always ambiguous, because there's so much exceptions. There's a lot of rules and principles when it comes to pitch accent, but there's also a lot of exceptions. And so it's always ambiguous to some degree. Until you look it up in the dictionary, you can never know for sure. And so you have to keep that in mind. But there are also a lot of patterns that help you predict the exact accent of nakadaka words. For example, if it's a combination noun, for example, keitai denwa, right? This is a combination noun. That's a combination of the noun keitai and the noun denwa. And whenever 2 nouns combine, pitch accent-wise, they follow very specific noun combination rules that let you predict with a very high degree of accuracy what the accent is going to be. So in this case, when 2 nouns combine, the accent is going to be determined by the second component, which in this case is denwa. And if the second component is 3 or 4 syllables, which it is, because it's 3 syllables, denwa, and it's either heiban or odaka, which it is, heiban, then that means that the accent of the new combination is going to be the first syllable of the second component, which means that it's going to be on the de. So it's going to be keitai denwa. And that rule might sound complicated, but once you practice using it, it becomes very quick and intuitive. So like I can look at a noun combination and instantly know what the accent's going to be. And so in this case, keitai denwa is technically nakadaka, and it's technically ambiguous because it's longer than 3 syllables. But at the same time, you can pretty much know what the accent's going to be pretty much for sure, because it's following the noun combination rules. And the noun combination rules are very consistent. They're one of the more consistent parts of pitch accent. So I'm not 100% sure, but with a high degree of accuracy. Also, if we're talking about verbs or adjectives, right? I'm not going to explain the whole thing because I explained it in the video you're talking about, talking about word level pitch accent. If you want to watch that video, I can put a link in the description. I explain how for verbs and adjectives, there's only 2 types when it comes to pitch accent, right? There's heiban and non-heiban, and the non-heiban ones are -2. So again, if you have a verb, then you can know with a very high degree of certainty, as long as it's nakadaka, right? If you're told, oh, this verb is nakadaka, you can know with a very high degree of certainty where the accent's going to be, because it's going to be on the second to last syllable, right? If someone told you nonoshiru is going to be nakadaka, you know it's going to be on the drop is going to be after the shi, because verbs that are not heiban always have the drop on the one before the shi. Now, there are some exceptions to this that involve special mora or tokushuhaku, but that's a whole other topic, so I'm not really going to get into that. But basically, your question is, could you talk about the cases where it would nevertheless be ambiguous? So basically, any time that it's not an adjective, a verb, or a noun combination, there's going to be a pretty high level of ambiguity there, right? Now, there are certain patterns that you can know of, and there's more than I can go into. But for example, if you have the kanji for men, which means mask, right? And that kanji men is in the second kanji in a 2 kanji compound, then a lot of the time that word is going to be nakadaka, and it's going to be -2. And so this is just a pattern that you pick up through learning the pitch accent of lots of words. You realize, oh, words 2 kanji compounds that end in men are either heiban or -2, and they're usually -2. And so like hyomen, for example, is -2. So if you picked up this pattern, then knowing that hyomen is nakadaka would be enough to know that it's -2, right? Also, nai, as in like uchi, like inside. A lot of times, if that kanji is in the second position of a 2 kanji compound, then the whole compound is going to be -3. So okunai, kokunai, gakunai, ikinai, they all follow that pattern. And so if you pick up on that pattern and then someone tells you that, for example, kokunai is nakadaka, you can know it's probably going to be a 2, kokunai, because that's the pattern of nai. And so there's lots of patterns that you can pick up on as you go. There's more than I could tell you in this video. But basically, this can help as well. But and any time that you don't know what the specific pattern is, and lots of times there just isn't a pattern, then it's going to be ambiguous. And so, like, for example, like tabemono, ikimono, tatemono. Anytime you have mono, it normally makes a nakadaka word, but for example, like tabemono is 4 syllables, right? Tabemono. And so just knowing it's nakadaka leaves ambiguity. It could be on the be or on the mo. And it turns out that in cases like this, a lot of times the accent can go either way. And so it can be either on the be or either on the mo. And if you look up in the dictionary, it says that. It's going to say, oh, it's 2 or 3. Now, most of the times, one of these is dominant. And I usually hear tabemono. And so the dictionary is not going to tell you that. And so in a way, it is ambiguous because you don't know how to pronounce it, right? If it gives you 2 possible pronunciations, one of them's probably dominant. And a lot of times the dictionary gets that wrong. Like, just because it's first in the dictionary doesn't necessarily mean it's the more dominant one. It usually does, but the dictionaries are old and they're biased in who they sampled. And so sometimes the more common pronunciation is actually the less common one in real life. But yeah, so even in cases like this where a lot of times if you have something mono, you can know it's going to be nakadaka, and you can know the dictionary is probably going to tell you it can be either one. Really, it probably is only one of those, and to know which one it's going to be, you have to actually hear the words. That's ambiguous. And then anytime you have just like a single word that's not a combination with anything else, it's not a structure, it's just a word, and it's nakadaka, and it's 4 syllables long, that is probably the most purely ambiguous nakadaka word. So, for example, murasaki, right? Murasaki is just a single word. It's not a combination with anything else. It's 4 syllables, and it's nakadaka. And it just happens to only have the accent on the second syllable, right? It's murasaki. Now, if someone just told you that murasaki was nakadaka, you wouldn't know whether it was on the second one or the third one until you looked it up. That's like purely ambiguous, right? And also there's other ones like mochiron, hajimete, where they are nakadaka words, and I don't know any pattern that would allow you to predict that. So they just are completely ambiguous. So pretty much the way I think about it is there's lots of patterns when it comes to pitch accent. And whenever you don't have any sort of relevant pattern and it's nakadaka and more than 3 syllables, then it is truly ambiguous. So it's like if it's a verb or an adjective, you know the pattern for that. If it's a noun combination, it's a pattern for that. If you know like the specific kanji, like, oh, it's nai, oh, it's, what was the other one that I used? It's men, then, okay, there's a pattern for that. But if you just have a word like mochiron, and you're like, well, I don't know what pattern would apply to that, or like kaminari, murasaki, and you don't know, then you truly don't know, and it's it would be completely ambiguous until you looked it up. So, yeah. To summarize, I would say that the ones that are not ambiguous are going to be noun combinations, verbs, and adjectives, and that is going to be the majority of 4 or more syllable nakadaka words. So that does remove like 95% of the ambiguity. And then there's even more patterns when it comes to specific kanji that usually create a certain pitch accent pattern, or other combinations. Like, for example, if you know how you can add kata to a verb, make it like aruki kata, tsukai kata. There's also a pitch accent pattern for that makes nakadaka words, so that's not going to be ambivalent or ambiguous. And even like hikoki is really a combination, right, of hiko and ki, and so that follows combination rules. And so basically when everything is just a raw unit that can't be divided into any smaller parts, it just is what it is, like mochiron or murasaki or kaminari, and it's nakadaka and it's more than 3 syllables, that is when it is going to be truly ambiguous. So hopefully that was clear. If it wasn't, then just ask a clarifying question. I'll try to be more clear on it. So Simon asks, "Hi Matt, since you've spent many years learning Japanese, could you tell us where you used to buy books? Apart from Amazon.jp, are there any bookstores in the US or Europe that sell original Japanese/light novels? Any websites that you'd like to share? Thank you as always." So I got a lot of my books in Japan. When I was in Japan and I decided to come home early, like I talked about earlier in this video, I spent all my remaining money on Book Off, buying used Japanese novels and manga, and I shipped them to my house. So a large chunk of my book collection I bought right before I went to Japan. Once I was here, I bought a lot of books just online. I used to buy books used on Amazon.jp. You can't do that anymore because when you try to buy used books on Amazon.jp, they won't ship it nationally anymore. They stopped doing that a couple years ago. But before, you used to be able to buy books used off Amazon.jp, and they would ship them here, and the books would be like 1 yen, which is a penny, and then the shipping would be like $13. So really, you'd get a book for like $13, and it was a decent deal. And so I used to buy books off that. Also, there was this used bookstore near my house. It's called Powell's Books. It's apparently the largest bookstore in the United States. It's really huge, and they have a pretty large section of used Japanese manga and novels. So, and a lot of it was really cheap. It's a really mixed bag. They don't actually keep them in stock. It's a used and new bookstore. So the Japanese section was just whatever used Japanese books they happened to have received. So it was really a mixed bag, but I still got a lot of books there for relatively cheap. And then there was a Kinokuniya bookstore, also where I live in Portland, Oregon, where that would sell new Japanese manga and novels for an outrageously expensive price. Like it was like 1.5 the original Japanese price, and you could see the original Japanese price like printed on the book. So occasionally I would buy books there as well. And also my local libraries all had Japanese books, so I got a lot of Japanese books there. And then, of course, I've talked about in the past how to get ebooks and stuff. So that's probably not relevant to you because that only applies to if you live in Portland, Oregon, but you asked, so there you go. So Luke Milligan asks, if you started an English school in Japan with classes, what would the classes look like? In this mental experiment, you have an unlimited amount of resources, but your English students are normal people who have school for the student aged and work for the adult aged. So, interesting question. I have a few clarifying questions that I would have wanted to ask, which is, for example, is my goal to just altruistically, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, help people actually get good at English? Or is my goal to make money as a businessman? Or is my goal to somehow find a combination of both? Because depending on the answer to that, how I would run my school would be completely differently, right? If I was just concerned about making money, then I would mostly just feed the people what they think they want, which is, you know, a white person standing in front of a classroom saying stuff they don't understand, and then grammar drills and like test prep, like TOEIC test prep and stuff like that. And maybe I would incorporate some SRS work into that so that they could be efficient at studying for these tests that have nothing to do with real English ability. And so, yeah, mostly I wouldn't actually bring in any of my actual language learning philosophy if I was just trying to make money, because that's not going to sell, right? Japanese people aren't going to buy into that. They have very fixed notions of about language learning, about what's going to work, and it would be much harder to sell input before output, immersion, you know, learning in an unstructured fashion. It's going to be extremely difficult to sell that in Japan, or anywhere else, but especially in Japan. And so, yeah, if I cared about money, I would probably just do the same sort of bullshit that lots of people are doing in Japan, selling fake English learning products and making a ton of money. On the other hand, if I didn't care about money, if I was just this altruistic millionaire who was doing this out of the good of my heart to try to help Japanese people learn English, then what I would do is basically, during the lessons, I would teach language learning philosophy. I would teach all the same stuff I teach out MIA, right? I would say, hey, this is an SRS, this is how it works, this is how you should use it. Immersion is this, input before output, input hypothesis. I would teach all of these ideas, and then I would, and that would take a few lessons probably, and then I would have like a lot of practical instruction about how to like set up your immersion environment, and I would help people acquire immersion content that was, suitable for them with regards to their interest and their level. And then after that, classes would probably just be gathering and having people just, first of all, maybe I'd give a little mini lecture just reminding people about the ideas that might be currently relevant to them. So, for example, if I see a lot of people are starting to whatever, like reach a more intermediate level, and then I'd give advice about sentence minding when you're more intermediate, or if they get to a more advanced level, maybe give a little mini lecture about the mindset you want to have as you get more advanced, and switching over to being more critical about your own ability in certain ways and things like that. And so I'd just give a little relevant talk, and then I'd probably do a Q&A, and then at the end, we would probably just be sharing time, where we just get in a circle and people just talk about their experience, what they've been immersing with, how that's been going, what's been going well, what have they been struggling with, and that would just help with motivation and stuff like that. And then they would go and actually do MIA in their free time. So basically, I would just teach MIA practice and theory in the classroom, tell them how to do it. I wouldn't teach them any English. And then after that, I would probably just have the students interact with each other to like share experiences, give each other tips, because a lot of times your peers have the potential to be better teachers than the people above you, right? Because they can relate with your same situation, and they can understand the struggles you're having in a more intimate way, because the master has already been away from those struggles for so long. He or she can forget what it was really like. And so mostly the whole class would pretty much just be about motivation, about not teamwork, but about having this kind of helpful mindset. It'd be kind of similar to what the server is now, the Discord server. And yeah, I wouldn't teach them any English, because I don't believe in teaching English, and I don't really. I think this type of class I'm talking about, it could be really cool, right? Like, it could be that meeting in real life once a week to talk about your language learning experiences with others. It could be that's extremely helpful. Like, for me, meditation is a solitary pursuit, right? It's something I do on my own that's self-guided. But a few times a month, I meet up with some meditation friends, and we talk about what our experiences have been. We've talked about books we've read recently related to meditation, and have discussions about meditation. And I always gain a lot of insights through that. I always really appreciate the advice that my friends will give me, and hearing the experiences of others. And I always feel really motivated and excited about meditation again. And so I could see a similar thing with language learning, maybe just being guided, but I wouldn't really be the teacher, but I'd be like, the guide, right? To guide the discussion, keep it on track, and give some pointers if people are stuck. That could be really beneficial. Now, realistically, if I was going to try to go to Japan and make English school, I'd probably try to find some balance of the two, right? So it's like, if I wanted to make money, to a certain degree, you have to feed them what they think they want, right? What they really want is English ability. What they think they want is grammar, speaking practice, test prep, and things like that. And so you have to give them a certain dose of what they think they want, or they're just going to be too skeptical, and the majority of them are going to leave, right? It's going to be a very small minority that truly understand and buy into my language learning philosophy. And so I'd probably give them decent doses of what they want, but I'd also try to encourage them to immerse as much as they could, and try to put an emphasis on that as much as I could. And I try to get them to use an SRS in all that they do, and try to get them to sentence mine alongside the more test preppy things that they do, and encourage them to focus on comprehension rather than speaking, and about trying to up their hours of passive immersion and find things fun to do in the language. I try to focus on that, and try to, as best I could, steer them in the direction of actually getting good at English, while also pandering to what they think they want, because otherwise there's not going to be any business. So yeah, that's all the questions for this week. Thanks again for everyone who's supporting me. And I guess I'll see you guys in the next one.